Thanks so much, Bani, for your thought-provoking presentation. Jules, please join us.
I didn't mention that I was having fan here.
Yeah,
so
we're having special treatment for our panelists here.
Total hierarchy here from stage.
Yeah, thanks so much for this really, actually quite a concise roadmap of a discourse of, I would say, an artistic research discourse in particular, and of course here at Karlsruhe University of Art and Design, we're also participating with Kim, with AI forensics, with media arts department, and the various design disciplines that come together, the design and theory disciplines that come together at Karlsruhe University of Art and Design. So it's really interesting to really see it come together in the narrative that you're presenting. But before I go on, let me introduce Jules Buchholz. Jules is an art researcher and political scientist. She studied philosophy, performance studies, fine arts, and security policy. Her work focuses on future design in scenarios and crises narratives, the impacts of politics of prevention, and autonomous machines. Thanks for joining us, Jules. And you have the word. You go first.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I think, especially for me, as I also have one working topic in scenario analysis and how that actually impacts our decision making. That's what it's basically good for. I was wondering, because you mentioned McNamara in the very beginning, and this notion of him with the fog of war sort of relates for me to another notion by Clausewitz about the theater of war, and basically content-wise these two notions mean actually the same, because they talk about the incommensurability of the real, of things that you just certainly cannot imagine. And I was interested in how, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on this aspect of visibility, for instance, in the aspect of revealing underlying infrastructures, as you said, but also in its connection to performativity, because obviously even Clausewitz was interested in theatrical means to still try to get a certain approach to something that he himself said is totally unsignifiable. And so maybe these two things, how do you understand performativity in contrast to maybe a Clausewitzian understanding in terms of rehearsing maybe, but still not being able to represent it, and then the aspect of visibility itself, revealing the future, making it public, making people being interested in it, but also triggering certain ways to the future and then not opening up other ways.
Yeah, there's, my humble opinion, there is a big difference between someone theorizing about war in a position of power with real impact on policies, and an artist who, with limited resources and probably limited scope in terms of like quantitative terms, when we are talking about making these systems of systems visible, and to deal and tackle complex issues and make them understandable, and let alone like perform these structures. We're talking about two different fields: policy and art. I'm not doing like theory here, not an ontology of what is art and what is policy making. It's just like a practical observation. There might be some overlapping, but even when we are using the same terms, we're talking about really different things, in my opinion, in my experience, my own experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you have a different opinion on that. When we're talking about policy, we're talking about agencies, political parties, governments, who are actually spending a lot of time and human resources and actually money on trying to deal with this complexity. That's how a government works. They need to deal with complex modeling systems because that's part of governance. That's one thing, and that's a very interesting topic because you need to understand how modeling is a key tool, a key strategy for governance and for governors, actually, for governments nowadays. So understanding which models they are using to understand what's not understandable, that's a really key issue if you want to do politics, activism nowadays. When I say modeling, I'm using this word in a very aware sense, you know, because the complexity of finance, geopolitics, of industrial production, people's income, people's health at a national scale requires models, like statistical models, visualization models, etc. So this modeling is not like a generic term, it's like part of the governance. Investigating that is really important because it has an immediate and direct impact on policies, on decision making, on where money is allocated in society and who decides what. When we move to a different field, which is not completely different, but it's at a different scale probably, which is the artistic field, the critical technology field, the experimental design field, that is the non-commercial oriented design field. We are talking about the same issues, but at different scales. It can be a disadvantage because we don't have the same knowledge about phenomena, we don't have the same resources about it, but it can also be an advantage because you can be freer to find shortcuts, to assemble ideas from different disciplines, for instance, to show images that cannot be shown in those other fields because you're not authorized to do it, because they're they're politically problematic, for instance, etc., etc., etc. I'm not saying anything new here. It's like basic, practical observation of things. I'm not saying that there are not overlappings between these two things. Fortunately, we have examples of artists that manage to influence policies in a way. Well, Adam, your work actually is precisely a good example of that, you know. But that's not what very often happens. Forensic architecture is another example, like a crystal clear example of that, you know. A group that is, like, by design wanted to be both artistic experimentation, experimenting with storytelling, but also influencing trials or even policy making in their work. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I just wanted to reframe it a little bit. Because otherwise personally, I find, I've been involved in activism, like grassroots activism. I was younger, much younger, unfortunately, and we did believe that we were changing policies, and eventually we were not doing that. We were doing something really interesting, something that inspired people, that changed, like, the imagination of what art could do in the street, for instance. I was part of this Yomango collective 20 years ago. We were doing shoplifting as some sort of a civil disobedience against chain stores, against precarious labor, etc. You know, we were thinking, yeah, we are changing the policies of these companies. We were not. We were doing something much harder, like changing the imagination of people, changing the idea of what's possible, and also understanding what is not possible. Understanding the difference between tactics and strategies. So probably you cannot change strategies, but you may have some interesting tactics in your hands. So that's already interesting. I'm sorry, I'm just building the frame around the answer, but I'm not answering.
Thanks, Bani. I'm going to pick up this strand of our conversation before I give the word back to Jules. And I'm going to connect it as an art historian. I'm going to connect it a bit to the history of art, and I find it quite refreshing that nowadays we're talking about artistic practices and not so much about works of art. right? So I think there is some progress in arts pushing out of the ivory tower, maybe, or institutions. And I think I felt like in your book, The Fog of Systems, you place a lot of hope in artistic strategies. And of course, I'm going to also be the devil's advocate here, and I'm going to question what art can really do. For example, the concepts you have presented, the models by people like Breton and Timothy Morton, they're inspiring. But at the same time, we all know whoever pursues a career in art or theory has to place a bet on the future. And often these models and artistic practices, we don't know how far they really go. Of course, yes, you addressed this already, comparing artistic strategies to policies, and of course, how much can we hope for, right? But to give it a little bit of a, also like to scale it on the times, art historically, you could say that pretty precisely, more or less 100 years ago, the historical avant-garde dreamt of fusing this transformative power of art with society and really to make a change. And of course, the situation back then couldn't have been more dramatic. The end of the world had already been rehearsed once with World War I, and we all know what came after that, right? And then after the Second World War, institutional critique, I think, laid an important foundation for the practices and also the immaterial practices that are that the artistic research practices of today are probably, based on, or without that maybe they wouldn't have evolved. So I'm absolutely on your side. I think that we're seeing some interesting changes in what art is, how it pushes the boundaries of disciplines to an extreme, how it's pushing out of the institutional frameworks, and maybe we can now phrase it a bit more precisely how the game has changed. If you see maybe the developments of the past 15 years, it's not that long, right? With respect to former practices of institutional critique and the failed avant-gardes, Peter Bürger, the avant-gardes have essentially failed. So would you feel like it's right to say that we could again place our bet on this third avant-garde movement maybe of the 21st century?
I don't know. Now I would place the bets all over the place, all over the shop. This is an institution. This could be called an institution in some way. And I think it's a really precious institution. Probably some students will hate this school. They will hate schools. They will hate teachers, which is also good. And so we should probably bet on institutions and also outside of institutions. Why making a difference? We need a lot of forces coming from all directions. And it's actually a good news that you have this kind of infrastructure. You have the possibility to do things with your body, with voice, but also with a wet lab downstairs. You can build stuff. You can learn how to solder things. You can organize groups of people doing something, be it a party or whatever it is. We need all of that. I don't think we should make of course there are differences, but we need the whole spectrum, so to speak. And also, you mentioned, process versus the work of art. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a scholar of aesthetics. What can I say? I think that both are interesting. Sometimes you need the work. Some fortunate artists that manage to go through some specific environment in the art world where there is money for objects and they are making objects. Listen, why not? It can be disgusting, because this money probably comes from finance or from some other kind of exploitation, and sometimes in a pretty straight way. But it's a different kind of choice. At some point in your career, you might want to do that. You realize it's not good, and you move on. Why not? Let's make mistakes, and let's tell others about our mistakes. So probably that's also useful. I wouldn't say, these biennials or the gallery world is completely bad. It is probably not great, but let's keep engaging with that. Why not? And again, regarding, you mentioned Bratton at the beginning of your intervention, and I was wondering, what would Benjamin Bratton say about that? He would say, no, art is completely irrelevant, so stop doing art. Culture is just a human exaggeration. Talking about your world of imagination is a waste of time. We have just one word, let's take care of that, so cut the crap and do something practical. I actually wrote an essay, like, when was that? Like a couple of years ago, a year ago, called The New World Order, like a bold choice of terms. And where it talks about planetary governance. And it says designers, speculative designers, urbanists, architects, and whoever wants to hop on board should actually deal about governance in different ways than politics, like party politics. I mean, it's right in a way. Not about the art part, but it's right in the sense that why not trying to redesign the way our work works? Why not? Probably it's not the only thing you can do. Probably you can do other things as well, but why not? I keep answering without answering, right? But anyways, that's my thing.
But even if you have the impression you were not answering, it's still quite revealing. So let me. I was wondering when I read. I prepared a little bit by reading some of the stuff you have written, and I was wondering about. Let's take one major technology that is always been considered as one major future driver. For instance, the autonomization of machines. If you had to describe the interwovenness in this specific grasp of you, like looking at the stack, how would you actually try to make that visible? Because connected to this question is my question again with the visibility. What do you think this can actually trigger if you show maybe the relation between human decision making and machine selection that is always part of our decision making?
Well, that's the Kim's territory, right? That's precisely what they're doing here. So how do you expose something that is not easy to expose because it's a series of mathematical models which build like statistical models, and bias is embedded. Oh, bias, like choices, forks are embedded in that process. So something is left out and something is considered as legitimate and operative and objective. So you can do that in many ways. I mean, the Vlad and Euler's diagrams is one way. So counter mapping, counter cartographies is one way to expose that. There was very famous Anatomy of an AI. It takes the Amazon Echo, and they literally take it apart. They actually break it apart and see what's inside. And from then on, they realize where this comes from and how it is used and how the actual device is made and how the process of extracting intelligence is actually carried out. And then also what comes after in the life of this device, so waste management and whatnot. And they talk about labor issues, etc. So you make a big map. And I know they're also working on a bigger map about that. So that's one way. Another way could be like performing things. I remember a project by Laurie McCarthy, an American artist. I've seen it it was in Holland some time ago. She was like arranging this strange situation where the visitors, the audience would get into this strange room with pillows, And you had to take your shoes off and lay down in silence and put your head on the pillow. And within the pillow there were some like speakers and the microphone. So you could hear a voice, supposedly an AI voice, like an automated, like a chat bot, asking you about what you wanted. And you could actually, hey, tell me about this. Asking questions to this chatbot. And you got answers whispered in your ears. And you could actually ask whatever you wanted to this chatbot. And at some point you realize that the chatbot was taking a little bit too long to answer. At some time you were making like hard questions and the chatbot would keep silent or would say something that was like kind of awkward. And that was an interesting project because it was supposed to be like an installation where you dealt with these chatbots, supposedly to get relaxed, like some kind of, you know, wholesome, mental, massaging, etc. And I have the impression, a little bit more than an impression, that that was not AI. It was not a chatbot. She was hiring people somewhere looking desperately on Wikipedia, trying to answer the questions of random people they would never meet in their life. That's an interesting way to make that kind of processes visible. Why not? It's like creative. Can it be turned into a commercial product? I don't think so. Will it have an impact on government policies, EU policies? I highly doubt it, but I can definitely say that it was impacting on young kids visiting the show in this venue in Eindhoven. So why not? It was probably worth doing it. And those are like examples of artistic methodologies, you know. And when I mentioned Matthew Fuller before, it was interesting. He was thinking about something else probably, but the way he was using the curiously ignorant, the punk attitude, the idea of trespassing locations, boundaries, or making times, changing, bending the time of our lives, or the bending the times of AI, like in the case of Lauren McCarthy's project. Why not? That's probably something worth exploring, and it can be done in so many different ways.
Yeah, interesting point, and also a little bit ironic concerning the last piece you've been describing. I have two last questions, if I may. And one is addressing the idea of the future itself. And we have been speaking about, one notion of you was that actually talking about the future is possibly speaking about the present all the time, because we have no idea what grade of complexity, or let's say progress, whatever we consider as a future technology, has already made. So I was wondering in your opinion on maybe not using future narratives anymore, because actually making things visible is a starting point for requesting ownership. And maybe ownership is one of the big problems that actually is one big driving force behind this whole capitalistic narrative of progress that you've been describing very quickly before. That's question one. And the other question I would be interested in is, we've seen this image of the flamingos in the lake, and I found that that was a moment where I really sort of thought I had understood what you were addressing, but then taking into account another thing you said, and that is the ungraspability of the whole machine. Let's call it a machine, the net, the stack, the whole thing. How are not this imagery, isn't that just showing one symptom of it all? But it doesn't. I mean, I was wondering, do you really believe that it could actually trigger only the slightest idea of the whole thing that is so complex and so real, to speak in terms of Lacan, that you can't really represent it, and you cannot really relate to it completely? Yeah.
I said at the beginning I was not a philosopher, and these are questions for a serious philosopher. Is there any philosopher in the room? Please step up.
Yeah, by the way, we are also open for questions from the audience. So, oh yeah.
Question and actually answers, please.
Come to the front. I'm sorry, it's a bit awkward, but we're being very relaxed here. Thanks so much.
Should I?
Ludmila Bogopai from... Yes, please, please.
No, very briefly. I mean, I was joking. I was not joking. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm a clumsy observer of things. But you're right. When you're talking about the future, as we heard earlier this afternoon, future, what we call future, which is a very imprecise term, is most of the time related to the idea of anticipate the future, prediction. And that's a big business. It's not just the human desire to know what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen to me in the future, when I'm going to die, or whatever. Will I fall in love? That's human, the human part of it. But of course, it's a big business case nowadays, whether it's about the weather, better commercial routes, predicting conflicts, as we've seen earlier this afternoon, predicting how we can make more money about something. So prediction is a big thing. And as you said, it's strictly tied to control, ownership of data, but also ownership of land, ownership of infrastructure itself, ownership of time, even, like in high frequency trading. And of course, that's problematic. That's why I'm not very especially fond of speculative design when they build futures, alternative futures. I feel it's probably not the right way to deal with these kind of things. And not because I don't like fiction. It's really important to deal with fiction, but it can be really dangerous because I've been in many speculative design or speculative fiction workshops and activities. And the end result was, first, a very consistent world, which is not the case. The world we are facing is not consistent. It's full of contradictions. And second of all, this speculative future was just the projection of current anxieties or current knowledge by the people participating in the workshop. So basically, it was just like a copy of the present they had in mind, or the future they would love to see, which is not interesting. We're not interested in people's desires. Well, of course we are, but they're not useful in terms of understanding the future. That's why I'm more interested in speculative present. There's another, I'm quoting Bratton again, I don't know why, but he's brilliant with words sometimes, most of the times. And he said, we should actually do an exercise of reversed uncanny valley. Uncanny valley is this model about robotics. The uncanny valley is when, it's the relationship between humans and androids becomes uncanny. And you cannot decide whether this entity in front of you is a human being or a robot. And that's why the uncanny moment. The reversed uncanny valley would be looking at what we're doing as human beings as it were located in the uncanny valley. So like looking at ourselves, our human civilizations, like we were already robots. And so changing that, or redesigning that. Or for instance, looking at the infrastructures we have, for instance, the military, the armies, and imagine radically new ways for the army to work. For instance, building an army just for climate change. I don't know, why not? That would be the speculative present approach, not the speculative future. We are not postponing our dreams. We are locating our dreams, our imagination, our fictions within the present. I think that's slightly more interesting than the future. And regarding the impossible thing, I'm not going to go into that because I don't have the right vocabulary to address the second part of your remark. But it's something that many, many people are dealing with at the moment, regarding the impossibility to really comprehend that complexity, and that is not a problem. That's a feature. That's something we should be proud of. That probably not everything is quantifiable, not everything is controllable, not everything is predictable. It sounds a little bit like naive, maybe. That's why I refrain from going on this, because I would sound really naive. But I'm reading a few things these days which go in that direction precisely. One is the new book by James Bridle, Ways of Being, which is, well, I won't say anything, but worth reading it. Another one by another young Italian scholar, by the way, Laura Tripaldi, Parallel Minds, has just been translated. And she goes a little bit in the same direction. She says there are different kinds of cognitions, of ways to understand cognition, besides human cognition. And there are some other kinds of cognition which we should acknowledge, but we should not try to fully grasp, because it's impossible. We should try to be diplomatic between different entities on this planet. So I felt that it also goes a little bit in that direction. Why grasping, controlling everything? There's something that is out of our control, full stop.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk, and also thank you very much, Jules and Katharina, for your questions and critical comments, which I think really expanded a little bit what we were talking about. What I would like to ask, maybe just like playing kind of cozy role of agent provocateur, in this like area of discourse you were like trying to map in your talk. First, you made a kind of differentiation between art and policy, and I'm just like asking myself, is it possible to make this differentiation? Because what we deal with, known as art, is totally a product of policies. Certain policies, like social policies, cultural policies, educational policies, etc., etc. So it's always a question about how much what we deal with as art is a product already of the policy. Just like to remind old quote by Adorno, that today we can build barricade only with the permission of a mayor, yeah, so of the city mayor. So it's just like it's the same with certain artistic practices. And I would like to ask, how do you see, let's say, the first of all the concept or your implied definition of what you defined as art and artistic practices nowadays, because I think it's really important to keep it in mind, because we still operate in this self-flattering mode of historical avant-garde. We as artists or cultural practitioners, those who, let's say, define, who let's redesign the society, let's do this and that. And I think it's a nice promise, but what I observe in the last years in the arts, especially the art theory discourse, it's always a kind of try to, let's say, squeeze certain practices into concepts or some interpretative patterns coming from philosophy, from media theory, whatever else. And we do artists not anymore, we need, it's not that we don't need, but the problem is that now what we can produce is not the theory of the avant-garde. What I really observe is that we need really a conceptualize this as a theory of the arrière-garde, yeah? Because we are like a little bit in a sort of delay, we only react in some, we are just confronted what was produced by the technologies, what is, let's say, imposed by politicians, whatever else, and this like theory of their arrière-garde, it's unfortunately our present and future probably also. Therefore it's also, probably you know the concept of Günther Anders, invertierte Utopisten, yeah, so the inverted utopians. He defined by this, like earlier we had the situation when we imagined some things which we couldn't realize. Nowadays is a reverted situation. Now we deal with the things, with the produced futures we can't even, we don't have even time capacity to reflect on, to digest, and they are like replaced with such a velocity that we become like really not only inverted utopians, we are like retarded inverted utopians, yeah, because it's just like, and art is like really in a kind of very late reaction all the time on, and those modes, I mean, I really appreciate the work by Trevor Pagan, but I ask myself, what is the kind of, let's say, epistemological surplus, just like aesthetization of certain, infrastructural marginalized area and just like putting them on the display? Is it like something more to do about it? I mean, of course, it's just like a lot of provocations, but I would like really to know how would you react on it. Thanks a lot.
Well, I don't think I will ever say what art should be.